The flicker of gray against the parched brown of the prairie was the first thing he noticed. It was the wrong color for this land, too delicate, moving with a desperate, stumbling speed that spoke of panic, not purpose. He had been mending a split rail on his corral fence, the August sun pressing down on his hat and the back of his neck, a familiar, honest weight. The man set his hammer on the post and straightened, his eyes narrowing against the glare. The gray flicker resolved itself into a person, a woman, her dark hair coming undone and whipping behind her as she ran. She was still a quarter-mile out, a frantic stitch in the vast, unblinking fabric of the Wyoming Territory. His hand went, by instinct, to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. It was a gesture as natural as breathing. He was a man who lived alone on his 160 acres, a claim proven up with 5 years of sweat and silence. His name was Jacob, though no one had used it in so long that it felt like it belonged to another man. Here he was just the man on Whisper Creek, a fact as solid and unremarkable as the granite outcrops to the north. His solitude was a kind of armor, but he knew it was brittle. Trouble, when it came to a place like this, did not come knocking politely. It galloped. And there it was, a rising plume of dust behind the running woman, thicker and faster than any dust devil. Riders, 3 of them, pushing their horses hard. They weren't chasing with whoops or hollers. They were methodical, like wolves running down a weakened doe, confident in the outcome. Jacob watched her fall, scramble up, and keep running, her gray dress now smudged with the ochre dirt. She was heading for the only shelter in a dozen square miles. His cabin. His claim. His trouble. He could have turned his back. He could have walked inside, barred the door, and become a deaf and blind man for the next 10 minutes. The territory was full of men who had survived by mastering the art of not seeing. But something in the straight, rigid line of her back, as she forced herself to her feet again, caught in his throat. It wasn't just fear. It was defiance. He picked up his hammer, his decision made in the space of a single, slow heartbeat. Therefore, when she finally collapsed into the shade of his lone cottonwood tree, gasping for air, he was there. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a canteen. "Drink slow," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. She looked up, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her chest heaving. She was young, maybe 20, with eyes that were black and deep and held a terror so profound it was almost calm. She was Chinese, dressed in a simple gray silk tunic and trousers that were torn at the knee. She took the canteen with a shaking hand and did as he said, sipping the lukewarm water with a control that impressed him. "They will be here in a minute," he stated. It was not a question. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud. "They want something I have." "Get in the cabin," he said, turning his back on her to face the riders. "Stay away from the window." She hesitated for only a second, then scrambled to her feet and disappeared inside the dark doorway of the clapboard cabin. Jacob walked deliberately to the porch steps and sat down, resting his Winchester rifle across his knees. He didn't lever around into the chamber. The threat of it was louder than the action itself. He just sat, a plain man on a plain porch, waiting. The 3 riders pulled up 20 yards from his cabin, their horses lathered and blowing. The man in the middle was thick-set, with a florid face and a clean duster that looked out of place on the trail. He had the soft hands of a man who paid others to do his hard work. He was the one in charge. The other 2 were simple, hired muscle, their faces blank and sun-scorched. The man in the duster smiled, a tight, unpleasant motion of his lips. "Morning. We seem to have lost something." Jacob didn't answer. He watched the lead rider's eyes flicker toward the cabin door, then back to him. "A girl," the man continued, his voice reasonable. "Chinese, Wandered off from the railroad camp. We're just looking to escort her back. Company property, you might say." "Don't see any company brands on this land," Jacob said, his voice flat. "This is a private claim, filed and registered in Cheyenne." He let the words hang in the hot, still air. He was reminding the man that there were laws, even out here. The leader's smile tightened. "I am Bartholomew Shaw, foreman for the Union Pacific Spur Line. We have a schedule to keep. That girl is a bonded laborer. She broke her contract." "Looks more like she was running for her life," Jacob observed, his gaze steady. "Appearances can be deceiving," Shaw said smoothly. "Now, we don't want any trouble. We'll just take the girl and be on our way. You can go back to whatever it is you do out here." The dismissal was clear. "You are nothing. This does not concern you." Jacob shifted his weight slightly, the rifle resting more comfortably in his hands. "This is my property. You're trespassing. The girl isn't here. You've wasted a good horse chasing shadows." Shaw's politeness finally cracked. A flicker of cold anger showed in his eyes. He glanced at his men. "He says she isn't here." One of the riders spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We saw her run this way, boss. Straight for this shack." "Then I suppose we have a contradiction," Shaw said, looking back at Jacob. "I find that when a man lies about one thing, he's usually lying about everything. Makes me wonder about that deed of yours. Sometimes paperwork gets misplaced." It was a direct threat, a promise of a different kind of violence. Shaw was a man who fought with ledgers and lawyers, not just guns. But he had guns too. A floorboard creaked inside the cabin. It was a tiny sound, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. All three riders heard it. Shaw's ugly smile returned. "Well now, sounds like you have a mouse in the house." Jacob knew he was outmatched, 3-1, but retreating now was the same as dying later. He had seen Shaw's kind before. They didn't stop until they had everything. Therefore he stood up slowly, the Winchester held loosely at his side, pointed at the ground. "You heard the man," he said, his voice dropping into a lower, harder register. "This is my claim. The next man to ride past that cottonwood tree without an invitation is going to find out how seriously I take that." Shaw considered him for a long moment. He saw a weathered man in worn denim, a man whose face was a road map of sun and wind. But he also saw the stillness in his hands, the utter lack of fear in his eyes. This was not some dirt-scrabbling farmer. This was something else, something older and more dangerous. Shaw was a businessman. He understood risk. "This isn't over," Shaw said, his voice losing its false friendliness. "I'll have what's mine." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They rode away, not at a gallop, but at a deliberate pace that was its own kind of threat. Jacob watched them until their dust was just a smudge on the horizon. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew with a cold certainty that the real trouble had just begun. Bartholomew Shaw was not a man to forget a debt, or an insult. He was about to find out that a few angry riders were the least of his problems. That evening the silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. The woman, she had told him her name was Anne, had cleaned herself up as best she could with the basin of water he'd provided. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her earlier panic replaced by a watchful calm. She had found a needle and thread in his sparse mending kit and was methodically stitching the tear in her trousers. "You should not have done that," she said, not looking up from her work. Her English was perfect, cleaner than his own, with a precision that was startling. "Done what?" he asked, cleaning his rifle at the small table. The smell of gun oil filled the room. "Help me. You have put yourself in danger for a stranger." They were on my land, he said simply, as if that explained everything. To him it did. His land was his life. An attack on one was an attack on the other. Mr. Shaw does not care about your land, she replied, her fingers moving deftly. He only cares about what is on it, or what passes through it, and he believes I belong to him. He called you a bonded laborer. She looked up then, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, only a cold, burning anger. He is a thief. He brought 200 of us from Guangzhou, promising good wages to lay track for the railroad. He pays us a fraction of what was promised, and charges us double for food and board at the company store. We are not laborers. We are prisoners in his debt. Jacob stopped cleaning the rifle. This was more than just a cruel foreman. This was an entire system of exploitation hidden away in the vastness of the territory. Anne reached into the sleeve of her gray tunic. She pulled out a small leather-bound book, no bigger than his hand, and a pencil stub. She placed it on the table between them. This is why he wants me back. Or wants me dead. He picked it up. The book was filled with columns of neat, precise characters, next to columns of numbers. It was a ledger. I can't read this. I can, she said. I kept the records for my father, who was a merchant. I learned English and arithmetic from a missionary. When I came here, Mr. Shaw thought a woman who could write would be useful. He had me keep the books for the camp. A bitter smile touched her lips. He did not realize I was keeping 2 sets of books, one for him and one for the truth. She pointed to a page. Here. He bills the Union Pacific for 50 kegs of blasting powder. He buys 20. The rest of the money goes into his pocket. Here. He claims wages for 300 men. We are only 200. Every week he steals the wages of 100 ghosts. She flipped through the pages. It is all here. Dates, amounts, shipping manifests he foolishly let me see. Enough to send him to a federal prison. A cold understanding settled in Jacob's gut. This small book was a death warrant. Anne wasn't just a runaway. She was a witness and a prosecutor, holding the evidence that could destroy a powerful man. And he, Jacob, had just painted a target on his own back by standing between that man and his only threat. He won't just ride in here again, Jacob said, thinking aloud. Not in the daylight. He'll be smarter. He will try to take your land, Anne said, her voice certain. He threatened it. A man like that, his threats are promises. He will go to the land office in Cheyenne. He will say you have not met the requirements of the Homestead Act. He will bribe a clerk. He will produce a witness who says you have not lived here for 5 years. The paper you hold will become worthless. She was right. His whole world, the 5 years of back-breaking work, the fence posts he'd sunk, the well he'd dug, it was all held together by a single piece of paper in a government office 100 miles away. A piece of paper that Shaw could make disappear. He looked at her, at the quiet determination in her face. He could still tell her to leave. He could ride in the opposite direction, abandon his claim, and disappear into the mountains. Survival was an option. But as he looked around the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, at the neat stacks of firewood, the clean-swept floor, he knew he wouldn't run. This place was more than just land. It was the only piece of himself he had managed to build. Cheyenne is a 3-day ride, he said. The U.S. Marshal's office is there. This book, he tapped the ledger, belongs with him. Anne's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. He will kill you on the road. Maybe, Jacob allowed, but if I stay here, he'll kill me for my land anyway. At least on the road, I'm moving. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the vast, star-filled sky. The night was quiet, but it was a listening quiet. He was making a choice that would cost him something he could not get back. his anonymity, his peace. He was choosing to stand with this stranger, to take her fight as his own. He would take the ledger to Cheyenne, and in doing so, he was declaring war on Bartholomew Shaw. The land beneath his feet felt both more precious and more precarious than it ever had before. By the time the first snows dusted the Laramie Range that November, the weathered clapboard of Jacob's cabin looked different. It looked permanent. 6 months had passed since the day a gray flicker of motion had changed the course of his life. The change was visible not just in the lines around his eyes, but in the very soil of his claim. The legal challenge from Shaw had come, just as Ann had predicted. A notice had been posted on his door, a summons to the territorial court in Cheyenne to defend his title. A man named Peterson, a freight hauler known to be in Shaw's pocket, had signed an affidavit claiming Jacob's homestead had been abandoned for long stretches. It was a lie, but a lie on paper held a dangerous power. Jacob had not waited for the summons. He and Ann had ridden out 2 days after the riders left, taking the less traveled high trail toward Cheyenne. They rode mostly at night, sleeping during the heat of the day in hidden arroyos and thickets of pine. He taught her how to handle a rifle and was surprised by her steady hand and calm eye. She, in turn, showed him how the flow of water could be diverted with a few carefully placed rocks to irrigate a patch of land he'd always considered useless. They spoke little, but a quiet understanding grew between them, forged in the shared tension of the trail and the silence of the vast, empty country. When they reached Cheyenne, Jacob went straight to the U.S. Marshal's office. The marshal, a weary man named Croft, with a healthy suspicion of railroad foreman, listened to Jacob's terse explanation and then spent 2 hours with Ann and her ledger. He asked sharp, pointed questions, which she answered with unassailable facts and figures. By the end of it, Croft leaned back in his chair, a grim look on his face. He sent a telegraph message to the federal judge in Omaha. Bartholomew Shaw was arrested 2 days later, not with a posse and a gunfight, but quietly, by 2 marshals who walked into his office at the railroad camp and presented him with a federal warrant for fraud and embezzlement. His power, built on bribes and intimidation, dissolved the moment the iron cuffs clicked shut. His hired guns scattered to the wind. The man named Peterson, when faced with Marshal Croft, recanted his story about Jacob's claim so fast he nearly fell over his own tongue. Now, 6 months later, the proof of their victory was all around. Jacob held the official stamped deed to his 160 acres, delivered by the marshal's own hand on his way back from the camp. His title was clear, his ownership absolute. That was the first outcome. The second was more surprising. The Union Pacific, embarrassed by the scandal, had conducted a full audit. They repaid the stolen wages to the Chinese workers, and many, finally free of their false debts, moved on. But some stayed. A new foreman, a fair man, had taken over, and An, whose testimony had been crucial, had been offered a position as a clerk and translator, a bridge between the company and her people. She had accepted, but on her own terms. She stayed on the homestead with Jacob. 3 days a week, a wagon from the camp would come for her, and she would spend the day working there. With her wages and the money Jacob made selling hay to the railroad, they prospered. Next to his cabin now stood a second, smaller building, built from the same sturdy timber. Inside there were benches and a slate board. This was the third outcome. It was a small schoolhouse where Ann taught the children of the remaining Chinese families to read and write in English. Jacob stood on his porch, watching as the last of the children headed home, their laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. Ann stood in the doorway of the school, waving, a smudge of chalk on her cheek. She was no longer wearing the gray silk of a fugitive. Today she wore a simple dress of blue calico, the color of the Wyoming sky. She saw him watching and walked over, wiping her hands on an apron. She leaned against the porch rail beside him, and for a time they just stood in the comfortable silence that had become their language. "The creek will freeze soon," he said, looking toward the line of cottonwoods, their leaves a blaze of gold. "Yes," she said. "We will need to bring in the last of the firewood." It was an ordinary conversation, the kind shared by people who have built a life together, one day at a time. The terror of that summer day felt like a story from another world. He remembered the first time he'd seen her, a flicker of the wrong color in a hostile landscape. Now her presence was the most right thing in it. The gray of her dress was gone, but the quiet strength it had represented was woven into the fabric of this place. He'd learned that a man's land wasn't just the dirt under his boots, but the line he drew on it, and that some lines were worth defending, no matter who came riding to cross them. It was a simple truth, but like the cabin he had built, it was strong enough to stand against the wind.